Welcome back to Vaulted World Secrets. And if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found us. Thank you for spending your time here tonight. Before we begin, if you were standing at the sealed entrance of a royal tomb 3,000 years ago and you could read the curse carved into the stone directly in front of you, would you have walked away? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Now let's begin. There is a word carved into limestone that has not been touched by direct sunlight in approximately 3,000 years. The carving is shallow, no deeper than a fingertip pressed with moderate force into wet clay, but the precision of its lines suggests it was made by someone who was not working quickly. Each hieroglyphic sign sits at the same depth as the one beside it. The spacing between them is even. Whoever cut these characters into the stone understood that the message they were inscribing would need to last, and they worked accordingly. The word is not a prayer. It is not a dedication. It is not a commemoration of anything anyone accomplished in life. It is a threat. And the person who ordered it, placed in this specific location on this specific wall in a chamber that was then sealed and was not intended to be opened again, was not writing it out of anger. They were writing it out of certainty. The ancient Egyptians were precise about certainty in a way that does not always translate cleanly into the frameworks of other civilizations. Certainty in their system was not merely a state of mind. It was a relationship with the structure of reality, with the underlying order that their theological tradition called Ma'at, the principle of cosmic rightness that governed the behavior of everything from the movement of celestial bodies to the flooding of the Nile to the proper conduct of the dead in their passage through the underworld. A person who acted with certainty in the Egyptian understanding was a person who had aligned themselves with that order. They were not guessing, they were not hoping, they were stating what was already true. And when that certainty was carved into stone, in the proper hieroglyphic form by a trained scribe, working in the commission of someone with the authority to make such a declaration, the carving was not a representation of a threat. It was the threat itself made permanent, housed in the material of the earth, addressed to anyone who would ever stand in that space and look at it, and also to forces that did not require a human intermediary to perceive what had been written there. This is where the record begins. Not with a robbery, not with a discovery, with a carving that has been sitting in the dark for 3,000 years, doing exactly what it was made to do. In the region of Upper Egypt, on the western bank of the Nile across the river from the ancient city of Thebes, the limestone cliffs that rise from the desert floor have been cut into continuously for approximately 4,000 years. Shafts were driven downward through sandstone and the harder limestone beneath it. Chambers were widened by the steady application of copper tools and organized human labor, the work progressing by the length of a chisel strike, repeated thousands of times in the dark and the heat until a room existed where there had been only solid rock. The work was finished with plaster, applied in multiple coats, gypsum quarried from deposits in the surrounding desert, mixed to a smooth consistency, and applied to the cut stone surfaces in layers that were polished flat and then painted. The paintings were not merely decorative, they were functional. They were part of an elaborate system for ensuring that the person interred in that space would have everything required for what came after death: the food, the tools, the company, the ritual words, the identification of the correct path through the underworld, all of it inscribed on the walls of the burial chamber so that it could not be lost, even if the physical objects placed inside the tomb were somehow removed. The chamber was then sealed, not locked. Sealed with plaster packed into the doorway openings, pressed flat, and stamped with oval administrative seals that identified the necropolis authority responsible for the burial. The expectation behind the sealing was absolute. The dead were not gone, they were relocated, they had needs. They required the maintenance of what surrounded them. The seal on the doorway was not a lock against intrusion. It was a boundary between one kind of existence and another, and crossing it without authorization was not merely illegal. It was a transgression against the structure of the universe as the Egyptians understood it to be constituted. The western bank opposite Thebes, the Theban necropolis, which modern archaeology maps as the Valley of the Kings, the Valley of the Queens, and the hill faces riddled with the tombs of nobles and priests and officials was already ancient by the time the events this account concerns took place. Generations of burials had accumulated there. By approximately 1100 BC, the necropolis was a city beneath the desert, a city whose population of the dead outnumbered, by a considerable margin, the living population of the valley above it. The workers who built and maintained these tombs lived in a purpose-built village to the south of the main necropolis, in the settlement now called by its Greek-derived name, Deir el-Medina. These workers and their families kept extraordinary records. They recorded their labor, their disputes with supervisors and with neighbors, their legal cases, their personal debts, their dreams, their crimes. They wrote on fragments of limestone and on broken pottery sherds, materials that Egyptologists call ostraca, and they stored them in the dry, steady heat of the desert, where organic material survives at a rate almost without parallel anywhere in the ancient world. Because of these records, certain events from this period can be reconstructed with a specificity that is, given the distance of 3,000 years, almost uncomfortable to sit with. The curse inscriptions that are central to this account are older than the New Kingdom period, into which most of the relevant events fall. They appear in the earliest strata of Egyptian funerary practice. The oldest documented examples of tomb curse texts come from the Old Kingdom from approximately 2400 BC, and they do not read, in translation, like the desperate warnings of frightened people. They read like legal instruments. They are formal and structured. They enumerate what is prohibited with the specificity of someone who has thought carefully about what forms a violation might take. They describe the mechanism by which the consequence will be delivered, and they invoke, by name and title, the specific entities within the Egyptian theological system understood to hold jurisdiction over the matter in question, not merely as witnesses, but as active participants in what the text describes. The god Thoth, keeper of divine records and lord of cosmic order, appears frequently, so does Sekhmet, the lioness-headed deity associated with fever, plague, and the kind of destruction that moves without discrimination through whatever is in its path. And so does the ongoing divine authority of the pharaoh or noble, in whose tomb the inscription was placed, an authority that did not terminate at death because it had never been entirely biological in the first place. What the excavation records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries return to repeatedly, and what more recent structural analysis of tomb architecture has had reason to revisit, is the question of where these inscriptions were placed. They were not always at the entrance, where a person approaching the sealed tomb would encounter them first. In some tombs, they were at intermediate points in the descent partway down a corridor, at the threshold between an antechamber and the inner room. In others, they were inscribed on the wall of the innermost chamber, directly facing the sarcophagus niche, positioned so that the last thing a person standing in the burial chamber would see before turning to leave was the inscription on the wall behind where the coffins had rested. A person who had entered through the sealed outer doorway and moved through 2 or 3 antechambers and reached the burial itself would encounter that text only after having already penetrated every layer of the tomb's spatial structure. A person who had already taken something from an outer chamber, who had already lifted an object from a shelf, or broken open a sealed jar, or unwrapped a bundle placed against the antechamber wall, would not see the warning until they were standing in the deepest room with what they had taken already in their hands. This is either a liturgical choice whose internal logic belongs to a system of belief that no longer exists intact, or it is a structural anomaly that early excavators noted in their supplementary field documentation and chose not to theorize about in their formal publications. Both explanations exist in the record. The notes in the publications sometimes diverge on this point. The gap between them has not been bridged. The texts themselves are not subtle. One inscription from the tomb of a 6th dynasty official named Kentika Ikheki, found at the necropolis of Saqqara, dated to approximately 2200 BC, describes in translation what will befall any person who enters the tomb and disturbs what is within it. the text specifies that this person will be seized by the neck, that their neck will be twisted in the same manner that the neck of a bird is twisted when it is killed, that this action will be performed by the dead man himself, whose capacity to act has not been diminished by the fact of his death. The phrasing in the original hieroglyphic is not metaphorical. The verb used is the same verb that would be used to describe a living person physically performing the same action. It is active. It is in what the grammar of the ancient Egyptian language renders as the present continuous not will happen, but is happening. The curse, in the language in which it was composed, is already in motion. It began at the moment of its inscription. It does not require a triggering event to activate. It is simply true, in the continuous present, the way a physical law is true, waiting only for the correct conditions to become observable. The image of the bird is not incidental. In the Egyptian symbolic system, certain birds carried direct associations with specific divine principles: the ibis and Thoth, the falcon and Horus, and through Horus, the pharaoh both living and dead, the vulture, and the protective goddess Nekhbet. These associations were operational rather than merely emblematic. Birds were observed. Their behavior was read as communication from the divine structure to those who had trained themselves to interpret it. To wring the neck of a bird was to perform a specific domestic action, a butchering action, something done in a kitchen or a workyard, not in a sanctuary. The curse inscriptions that apply this action to a potential violator of a tomb are doing something deliberately precise. They are removing that person from the category of beings who are under divine protection and placing them in the category of things that are processed and consumed. You will not be judged. You will be slaughtered. You will not face the divine tribunal. You will be reduced to what we do with our hands when we prepare meat. The threat is legal and theological, and contemptuous simultaneously, composed by people who understood that precision in language was a form of power, that an inexact threat had inexact effects, and that what was carved into stone in the burial chamber of the dead was not merely saying something, but doing something, and would continue doing it in the continuous present for as long as the stone lasted. By approximately 1100 BC, the western bank of the Nile opposite Thebes was under conditions that the Egyptian state had not adequately prepared for. Egypt, in this period, the 20th dynasty, the reign of Ramesses IX, the eighth pharaoh to bear that name, was a state managing the slow divergence between its ceremonial forms and its actual resources. The immense building programs and military campaigns of Ramesses II, who died in approximately 1213 BC after a reign of 67 years, had left an infrastructure that subsequent administrations could not fully sustain. The 20th dynasty maintained the titles and performed the ceremonies. But the granaries that supplied the state's workers ran short with increasing frequency, and the shortfalls were not minor or occasional, they accumulated across months. And the people who experienced them were not abstract statistical workers, but families in a remote community who had no source of income except the rations the state was obligated to provide. The records from Deir el-Medina in this period document a labor action that has no parallel in the records of most ancient civilizations. The workers of the necropolis, their rations now 2 months overdue, laid down their tools and sat outside the sealed storage magazines, refusing to work until their pay arrived. They stated their position clearly. They used the scribal and legal vocabulary of their community to make a formal demand. The state eventually delivered what was owed, but the event was a symptom of something that did not resolve. The condition that produced it continued, quietly, behind the ceremonial surface of the dynasty's self-presentation, and it was pressing not only on the workers who built the tombs, but on the entire social and economic fabric of the community that surrounded the necropolis. Into this environment, the problem of tomb robbery on the West Bank became systemic. The tombs were being entered not occasionally, not by outsiders who had no knowledge of the terrain, but consistently, methodically, by people who understood the architecture of these spaces from the inside. People who knew which passages had been reinforced and which had not. People who knew which chambers had been provisioned most richly before the plaster seals went on. People who knew where the walls were thinnest, which burial shafts had been cut through softer stone, which fill above a chamber entrance, was loose enough to be moved quietly in the dark. The workers of Deir el-Medina had built the tombs they were now, in some cases, entering. They had carried the limestone rubble out of the shafts. They had smoothed the plaster walls with their own hands. They knew the dimensions of every chamber in the way that a person knows the dimensions of a room they have stood in every day for years. And some of them, pressed by the failure of the state to deliver what it had promised, by the ordinary and extraordinary needs of families living in a community that had been essentially abandoned by its administrative superiors, had begun to act on that knowledge in the dark, in the hours after midnight, with copper tools and oil lamps, in spaces where the curse inscriptions on the inner chamber walls faced not the entrance but the exit. The formal administrative response, when it finally arrived, was procedurally elaborate. In approximately the 16th year of the reign of Ramesses IX, corresponding to roughly 1110 BC, the mayor of the East Bank of Thebes, a man named Khamwaset in the surviving documents, initiated an official investigation into the condition of the royal and noble tombs on the West Bank. The investigation took the form of a physical inspection commission. A group of officials, including priests, scribes, and administrative representatives who moved through the necropolis tomb by tomb, examined each entrance, noted whether the seal was intact, and recorded their findings in the careful procedural language that Egyptian administrative culture had refined across centuries. The document that records this inspection is the Papyrus Abbot, currently held in the British Museum, acquired in the mid-19th century through a sequence of transactions that was, by the conventions of that period, entirely unremarkable. The papyrus extends approximately 3 meters when unrolled. Reading it in sequence, following the commission as it moves from tomb to tomb, produces an experience that modern scholars have occasionally struggled to contain within the standard register of academic description. The findings accumulate, intact. The seal is undisturbed. The passage has not been entered. Intact. Intact. And then, without any shift in tone in the documentary language, without any editorial annotation, the seal is broken. The passage has been entered. The chamber has been disturbed. The record of the moment of discovery is as procedural as the record of the intact tombs that surround it, because procedural language was what the scribes were trained to produce, and the training held even at the moments where it was bearing the most weight. The Commission's findings across the full inspection revealed a pattern that the document records without explicitly emphasizing. Many of the royal tombs were intact. Their seals were unbroken, their entrances undisturbed. But those that had been entered had been selected with precision. The robberies had targeted the tombs most richly furnished relative to the ease of their structural access. This was not random. This was not opportunism. Someone who had been inside these spaces while they were under construction had provided the information that shaped the selection. The tombs that were most worth entering had been identified by someone who knew what was inside them because they had been involved in putting it there or in the construction of the chambers that housed it, or both. The inspection commission was, in recording the pattern of violations, recording evidence of exactly the kind of insider knowledge that the community structure of the Theban necropolis workers made readily available to anyone in that community who wanted to use it. The investigation moved beyond the physical inspection into interrogations, and it was in this phase that the name Amen Pnufer entered the record. He was a stonecutter. His occupation, placing him within the broad labor community affiliated with the necropolis, the precise documentation does not confirm whether he lived within Deir el-Medina itself or in the wider orbit of workers associated with the site, but the nature of his work meant he knew the physical fabric of the tombs from direct engagement with it. At some point during the investigation, he was arrested. He was brought before officials, and then he confessed in a document that has survived, which is the Leopold Amherst Papyrus, a text currently divided between collections in Brussels and New York. Its two halves separated before scholars understood they were reading fragments of the same document. The connection established through decades of comparative analysis by researchers working with archives thousands of miles apart who recognized that the edges of the text matched. The confession, as it appears in translation, is one of the most detailed and structurally strange first-person accounts of tomb robbery that has survived from the ancient world. It exceeds, in its specificity, what an interrogation would typically require for a legal determination of guilt. Amenhotep did not merely confirm that he had entered a tomb. He described the manner of entry, the approach to the shaft in the dark, the tools they carried, the specific sequence of actions used to penetrate the entry blocking without creating noise that would carry. He named the other members of the group, other stonecutters. And this is the detail that the broader investigation would spend considerable effort pursuing at least one individual whose occupational connection placed him within the lower administrative hierarchy of the necropolis itself, not among the manual workers, but among the people with formal institutional access to information about the site's management and layout. He described what the group found inside the burial chamber once they had broken through. He described the mummy and its coffins. He described the gold, the objects still in their original positions after 4 centuries, the amulets placed within the wrappings of the body itself, the decorative elements of the coffin lids that caught the torchlight when the light first reached them in the inner chamber. He described what was taken, and then he gave the weights of the gold, the specific quantities divided among the members of the group according to an arrangement that had clearly been established before the group ever descended the shaft. The weights. This detail recurs in the scholarly literature on this document with a frequency that reflects its significance. The recording of specific quantities of gold and their proportional distribution implies that the group had brought with them the means to measure and divide the proceeds scales, or sufficiently precise prior negotiation about the system of division to allow those figures to be stated afterward with confidence. This was not an impulsive action by people responding to an unexpected opportunity. This was a planned operation with a pre-established organizational structure, carried out by people who knew what they would find and had decided in advance how they would share it. The care implicit in the weights is also, perhaps, one reason why the confession is as complete as it is. Amenhotep was describing something that had been carefully planned and carefully executed. The care was still visible in his account of it. The tomb he described entering was, based on scholarly analysis of the text and its internal references, most likely that of Sobekemsaf II, a pharaoh of the 17th dynasty who had ruled from Thebes during the Hyksos occupation of northern Egypt, approximately 400 years before the period of Amenhotep's crime. The 17th dynasty rulers were buried in the area now known as Dra Abu el Naga, a hill face on the northern part of the Theban West Bank, associated with the earlier royal burials that predated the establishment of the Valley of the Kings as the primary royal necropolis. Their tombs were modest compared to the engineering of the New Kingdom royal tombs. Small mud brick pyramid chapels above ground, offering niches at their bases, burial shafts sunk into the hillside below, subterranean chambers cut through the local sandstone. By the time of Ramesses IX, the superstructures of many of these earlier tombs had partially collapsed or been quarried for materials. The pyramid chapels were ruins. The burial shafts below them, cut through harder stone, had remained structurally intact. The burials inside had remained provisioned relatively undisturbed across the 4 centuries since the interments, the sealed chambers doing exactly what they had been constructed to do, holding what had been placed in them in the steady dark of the desert hillside. Until the night Amenhotep's group came down the shaft. He described what the chamber was like when the torchlight first reached it. The pharaoh was still in his coffins. The queen, Nubkas, was in an associated burial space. The coffins were covered in gold. The objects placed around the burial, the provisions, the ritual equipment, the items intended to accompany the royal dead through whatever lay beyond the ceiling of the tomb, were still in their positions. 400 years of absolute stillness, and then the group moved through it with their copper tools and their lamps, working efficiently, taking what they had come to take, dividing the gold by lamplight on the hillside outside, and dispersing into the dark before the valley began to lighten toward dawn. On the wall of the innermost chamber, the wall that faced away from the entry passage, the wall that a person leaving the chamber would see in front of them. As they turned toward the exit, there was an inscription. The 17th dynasty royal burials at Dra Abu el Naga carried curse texts consistent with the royal funerary tradition of their period. The specific text on Sobekemsef's chamber wall is not fully recoverable because the tomb has not been definitively identified among the excavated sites, and the chamber walls, as found by modern archaeology, show disturbance consistent with thorough robbery and subsequent exposure. But what the excavations at Dra Abu al-Naga have produced the ongoing German-Egyptian mission, working the site across recent decades, includes physical evidence fully consistent with Amen Panufer's account. Fragments of coffin wood, mummy wrapping material, the scattering pattern of objects and organic matter that indicates a chamber entered and systematically stripped. The mummy, where identifiable through fragmentary remains, showed evidence of having been unwrapped, the wrappings disturbed, the body exposed, the amulets placed within the wrappings removed, and on sections of chamber wall that survived sufficiently to preserve painted or carved inscriptions, texts were found in positions consistent with the placement patterns noted at other royal burial sites from this and related periods facing the exit, where they would be seen last. Where a person leaving with something in their hands would encounter them at the moment of departure, in the moment between having taken and having gone. The investigation that followed Amen Panufer's confession reached into the network through which the stolen materials had passed after the robbery from the original group to the receivers who converted the raw gold and portable objects into transactions the Necropolis administration could not trace. The Leopold Amherst Papyrus and its associated documents preserve records of additional interrogations, additional confessions, additional layers of the distribution network. Some of the individuals Amen Panufer named were located and questioned. Some of those questioning sessions produced further testimony. Some of those named in the subsequent testimony were in turn brought before officials. The administrative machinery of the late New Kingdom legal system worked through its procedures with the diligence of a tradition that had been processing cases of this kind for generations, even as the institutional framework sustaining that tradition was under pressures it had not yet acknowledged in any formal documentary sense. The members of the group who had descended the shaft with Amen Panufer, the other stonecutters, the individual with administrative connections appear in the subsequent record in ways that can be at least partially traced. Their names surface in the proceedings. Some of them are referenced in connection with hearings at later stages of the investigation. The administrative record of the period, dense with the specific documentary habits of the Theban necropolis administration, contains them in the way it contains most of the individuals processed through this particular legal event, not completely, not without gaps, but present. Their names appear before the interrogations, and in some cases after them. The thread, fragile and often broken, nonetheless exists for most of them across at least some portion of what the record documents. Amen Panufer's thread ends at the confession. His name appears in the Leopold Amherst Papyrus through the confessional account itself and in a brief administrative notation referencing a subsequent procedural stage. After that, the record does not contain him. Not in the outcome documentation for the robbery trial proceedings, where fates of individuals processed through the legal system were recorded in the same administrative language as everything else. Not in the Deir el-Medina census and labor records, which for certain periods are comprehensive enough to track individual workers across years of documented activity. Not in any administrative list of punishments delivered or sentences pronounced in this period that has been identified among the surviving papyri. The record does not record what happened to him. It contains his words, completely and in detail, and it does not contain him. The space where his subsequent history should be is as dark and as still as the chamber he entered. Dr. Yaroslav Cherny, the Czech Egyptologist whose decades of engagement with the Deir el-Medina ostraca and the administrative papyri of the 20th dynasty established the foundational framework within which all subsequent work on these materials has operated, noted in his research that the outcome documentation across individuals involved in the robbery trials was inconsistently distributed. His observation, careful and qualified, published in contexts where such caution was professionally appropriate, identifies a pattern. Certain individuals, specifically those who had provided the most detailed and self-implicating confessional testimony, those whose accounts had named others and formed the evidentiary basis for subsequent stages of the investigation, were more likely than other individuals processed by the same legal proceedings to have unclear or absent outcome records. This observation does not appear in Czerny's formal publications as a formal conclusion. It exists in the documentary record of his engagement with these materials in research notes, in correspondence with colleagues who were working on the same materials from different institutional positions, as something he saw and recorded without choosing to build an argument upon in print. The observation is there. The argument is not. Whether this represents the appropriate restraint of a scholar unwilling to exceed what the evidence permits, or something else entirely, is not determinable from what has survived of his private and professional correspondence. What is determinable is that he returned to this observation more than once. In notes spanning different stages of his career, across different archival engagements with the same body of material, the observation about the specific gap in outcome documentation for the most detailed confessors reappears, not elaborated, not built upon. Returned to, and noted again, and left again in the same qualified condition. Prof. John Coleman Darnell of Yale University, whose work on the religious and funerary texts of the Theban region has contributed significantly to the understanding of how written language functioned within the Egyptian cosmological system, has written about the curse inscriptions in a framework that places them within the Egyptian understanding of textual power. The idea that inscribing a thing was not merely representing it, but participating in it. In the Egyptian system, the hieroglyphic sign for a concept had a relationship with the thing it designated that exceeded the symbolic in certain contexts, in certain locations. The sign and the thing it referred to were understood to be in active contact. A curse inscription, in this framework, was not a passive document. It was an operational entity whose function was continuous and did not require a reader to activate it. The carving completed the process. What the process did after the carving was not dependent on whether anyone ever read the text. It was dependent only on whether the conditions described in the text ever came to obtain. And if they did, if a person ever stood in that space with something taken from it in their hands, the text was already engaged with that situation in real time in the continuous present of its grammar, in the only tense it had ever been written in. The physical environment in which all of these events took place is something the written sources touch on only in the margins, in the technical language of administrative documentation and the formulaic language of the curse, inscriptions themselves. But the environment is partially recoverable through other means. The accounts of excavators who entered sealed Egyptian tombs for the first time in the modern era describe conditions that the prosaic conventions of archaeological reportage struggle to hold. The air in a burial chamber sealed for centuries is unlike any air that exists in ordinary experience. The sealing process, multiple layers of plaster packed into the doorway openings, stone plugs in the royal burials set into carved channels in the floor and then plastered and stamped, left to harden in the desert heat, was not airtight by any modern engineering standard, but it was close enough that the air inside changed profoundly across the decades and centuries. It became still in a way that moving air cannot approximate. It accumulated the particulate matter of the materials within, the fine powder of desiccated linen wrappings, the volatile compounds of the aromatic resins applied to the mummy during the mummification process, the limestone dust that the sealing of the space had not entirely excluded. When the outer seal was first broken, when a person pushed through the plaster fill and dropped into the entry shaft, the air that met them had a density and a character that nothing in their ordinary experience would have prepared them for. Howard Carter, writing in his journals in 1922 and 1923 during the excavation of the tomb of Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings, maintained the precise and restrained documentary register that his training and temperament demanded. His professional documentation of the excavation is a model of careful observation, but there are passages in those journals, and in the book he later assembled from them, where the language he reaches for to describe what a specific space felt like, the weight of the air, the quality of the dark beyond the torchlight, the particular character of the stillness in the innermost chambers, exceeds the vocabulary of archaeological reportage and approaches something that he seems unable to categorize within any existing framework. Carter was not inclined toward mysticism. The moments in his writing where the empirical register bends are not many, they are present. The spaces he was entering were doing something to the language he used to describe them, and he recorded that effect without being able to fully account for it. He was not alone in this. Arthur Weigall, the Inspector General of Antiquities in Upper Egypt in the early 20th century, wrote about the experience of entering sealed chambers with a degree of frankness that the more formally published members of the archaeological community generally avoided. His descriptions of the specific quality of sound inside these spaces, not silence, but something that seemed to occupy the space silence usually does while being subtly unlike it, a pressure rather than an absence, appear in his published writing alongside careful disclaimers that prevent the observation from becoming an argument. The disclaimers are there, so is the observation. The two coexist in his prose in a way that suggests he was not entirely certain which of them to trust. The ancient Egyptians had a word for the quality of sacred space, the specific atmosphere of a place where divine or funerary power was concentrated. The word in older scholarship was often translated as dread, in more recent work as awe, and in some contemporary translations as a compound that attempts to hold both meanings in the same space. All of these translations are reaching for something the original contains that none of them fully captures. In the Egyptian understanding, the dread and the awe were not two separate responses that happened to be produced by the same stimulus. They were the same response. The fear was the reverence. They were not merely similar, they were identical. A person who stood in a sealed burial chamber and felt in the quality of the air, or in the weight of the dark at the edge of the torchlight, or in the specific texture of the silence, something that altered the way they moved more carefully, more quietly, with attention to where their hands were and whether their lamp was burning steady was not. In the Egyptian framework, experiencing an irrational response to a superstitious belief. They were experiencing an accurate perception of something that was actually present in that space. The precision of that perception was the point. The group that descended the shaft into the burial of Sobekemsaf would have carried oil lamps or resin torches. The light these produced was warm, localized, limited a globe of amber illumination, perhaps 2 or 3 meters in radius, beyond which the dark of the chamber was complete. The painted walls of the spaces they moved through would have appeared differently in that flickering light than they appear in the flat illumination of modern photography. The colors, the deep ochre grounds, the white figures processing in their formal arrangements, the blue-green of depicted faience objects, the black of hieroglyphic columns would have shifted and pulsed with the movement of the flame. The painted figures on the walls, who in direct modern lighting are static, would in the torchlight have appeared to move at the edges of their visibility, the shadows cast by the painted relief shifting as the lamp moved forward, so that the text and the images had a quality of animation that the stone does not possess, but that the light briefly lent them. And the curse inscription on the innermost chamber wall, the one facing the exit, positioned to be encountered by a person leaving rather than arriving, would have been visible at exactly the moment of departure. The group, or some members of it, would have been literate enough to recognize hieroglyphic text when they saw it, living as they did in the community of workers who had spent generations maintaining and building these spaces, whether they could read the specific signs, whether they understood what they were looking at, whether they understood that the grammar of what was carved on that wall placed the action it described not in the future, but in the continuous present. These are questions the record cannot answer. The record tells us only that they left, that they divided the gold on the hillside, that they dispersed, and that most of them, in some form, are in the record after, and that Amenpneufer, who gave the most complete account of what they did and how they did it, is not. The Papyrus Abbot investigation did not conclude cleanly. The political dimensions of it, the jurisdictional dispute between the East Bank mayor, Kamwaset, and the West Bank mayor, a man whose name appears in the documentation as Pauero, who had administrative responsibility for the necropolis and substantial reasons to want the investigation's findings to reflect his management of the site in the best possible light, ran through the entire proceeding and shaped its outcomes in ways the papyri record, without making fully transparent. The findings of the inspection commission were in some cases disputed. The political contest between the two officials used the inspection findings as its primary ammunition, and the truth of what had happened in the tombs was entangled from the beginning with the question of which official was responsible for allowing it. Within approximately a century of these events, the unified Egyptian state that had produced the papyrus abbot and the administrative machinery capable of generating it would effectively fracture. The high priests of Amun at Thebes accumulated military and administrative authority sufficient to function as a parallel state in the south. The pharaonic line continued in the north in increasingly diminished form. The institutions, the scribal offices, the necropolis administration, the court system, the trained personnel who made these documents possible entered a period of fundamental restructuring from which they did not emerge intact. The records from Deir el-Medina thin and then effectively end. The community that produced those extraordinary ostraca dispersed. The village was eventually abandoned. The desert moved into the spaces where people had lived, and the dry air preserved what they left behind in the way it had always preserved things, without discrimination, without intention, preserving what happened to be in the right place and made of the right materials by the pure accident of proximity and chemistry. The tomb of Sobekemsaf II has not been definitively located. The area of Dra Abu el-Naga, where it is expected to exist, has been excavated repeatedly and continues to be excavated by the ongoing German-Egyptian archaeological mission working the site. The evidence for the burial is present: the coffin fragments, the mummy wrapping material, the Book of the Dead papyrus associated with Sobekemsaf that entered the British Museum's collection in the 19th century with no excavation provenance attached, having passed through an unknown number of hands between when it left its original location and when it was formally acquired. The burial itself, the sealed subterranean chamber, with whatever remains of its painted walls and carved inscriptions, has not been identified in a form that allows definitive confirmation. It may be accessible below the surface, at Dra Abu el-Naga. It may have been further disturbed in the centuries after Amenpneufer's group visited it. It may be in a section of the hillside that the current excavation grid has not yet reached. The absence of its definitive location is not unusual given the scale of the necropolis and the state of the investigation of it. Much of what lies below the surface of the Theban West Bank has not yet been mapped, and the work of finding what is there continues in the slow, careful way that serious archaeology has always proceeded. The gold that Amenpneufer described taking from the burial the objects he weighed and divided on the hillside in the dark before dispersing into the valley did not survive as a traceable collection. Gold, melted down, loses all provenance. The amulets and smaller portable objects may have entered the broader stream of Egyptian antiquities in forms now impossible to identify. The distribution network that the investigation attempted to trace, following the converted proceeds through the hands of receivers and resellers into transactions the Necropolis administration could not reconstruct, dispersed into the economic fabric of the Theban region without leaving a recoverable thread. What had been inside the tomb had become something else. The inscription on the inner chamber wall, in the continuous present of its grammar, had not. The curse inscriptions of ancient Egypt continued to be composed and carved long after the New Kingdom period. They appear in Third Intermediate Period tombs and Late Period tombs and Ptolemaic tombs, adapting their language and their invocations to the shifting theological framework of different centuries while maintaining certain core elements with a consistency that spans 2,000 years of institutional and cultural change. In the Ptolemaic period, when Egypt was governed by a Greek dynasty maintaining the forms of pharaonic tradition while administering through a bilingual bureaucracy, the inscriptions sometimes appear in two scripts simultaneously, hieroglyphic and demotic, written side by side on the same wall, the same warning in two writing systems, each with its own understood relationship to what written language accomplished in the material world. The duplication could be read as an attempt to extend the warning's reach to a wider audience, to cover those who could read one script and not the other. It could equally be read as an amplification of the inscription itself, the statement made twice in two systems, the textual power doubled by the doubling of its form. Both readings are supportable. The Egyptians were capable of doing more than one thing at once with a single act, in the way that systems of sufficient sophistication often are. The last substantial royal context curse inscription currently identified in the Egyptian documentary record dates to approximately the 4th century BC, the final period of indigenous Egyptian dynastic rule before the Persian conquest and the Macedonian succession, and the Ptolemaic dynasty that followed. The text belongs recognizably to the same tradition as inscriptions carved 2,000 years before it. The language has shifted in the ways that 2,000 years of language change inevitably produce. The orthography reflects the scribal conventions of a very different period, but the core of the warning is unchanged. Do not enter, do not take, do not disturb what has been placed here in the care of those with the authority to act on its behalf, and if you have entered, if you have taken, what follows has already begun. Not will begin, has begun. The action described is in progress. The grammar does not acknowledge the interval between the writing and the reading. The threat collapses that interval. It addresses the reader as though the carving and the reading are occurring at the same moment, as though the centuries between the inscription of the text and the torchlight illuminating it are a pause rather than a distance, a held breath rather than a gulf between worlds. The Theban necropolis is still there. The limestone cliffs above the Valley of the Kings maintain the same relationship to the sky and the river that they have held for 50 million years, since before any human presence existed in that valley to observe them. The tombs open to visitors have been fitted with electric lighting and monitored ventilation systems and carefully managed pathways that direct the flow of human movement away from the painted walls, because the humidity generated by thousands of visitors moving through the spaces in a single day poses a threat to the painted plaster surfaces that 3,000 years of dry sealed air had not. Instruments measure temperature and particle count in real time in the most heavily visited chambers. The monitoring is precise, the data recorded, the conditions adjusted when they deviate from established parameters. The science of preservation has extended its reach into spaces where, for 3,000 years, nothing was measured and nothing adjusted and nothing was disturbed in any way at all. The sealed tombs, those that remain closed, those that have been resealed after study, those beneath sections of the valley floor and hillside that have not yet been excavated, contain air as unchanged as anything in the human inhabited world can be after this much time. The inscriptions in those unfound chambers face whatever direction they were carved to face, in whatever relationship to the entry passage and the sarcophagus niche and the exit corridor that the person who commissioned them chose, for reasons that may or may not be fully recoverable from what survives of the funerary tradition they were part of. In the continuous present of the grammar in which they were written, they are still doing what they were made to do. The hand is still raised, the neck is still in it. The threat does not wait to be read in order to be true. It was true at the moment of its carving. It was true in the middle of the night when Amen-Penufer stood in the innermost chamber of Sobekemsaf's tomb with the gold already in his hands and the lamplight catching the carved signs on the wall at the exit. It was true in the days after he gave the confession that preserved his words so completely. It was true in the long silence after his words, where his own history should have continued and did not. And it is true in the steady dark of the chambers that have not yet been opened, where the limestone holds its shape and the still air holds what it has always held, and the carved words face in the direction they were placed to face, addressed to no one in particular, addressed to whoever is standing in front of them right now, in the only tense the language of these inscriptions ever used, the present continuous, the ongoing, the already begun. If you find yourself drawn to histories like this, to the places where the record goes silent at exactly the moment it should be speaking, consider subscribing. There are many more of these silences, and not all of them have been explained.